Hello, my name is Lee, and welcome to another More Fun Making It episode in which I don't really make anything again. This will be the first in a 3-episode series in which I will repair and restore 3 Atari 2600's in a range of conditions. In this episode I will be repairing Atari No. 1. Imaginative title, thank you marketing team. I wouldn't blame you for thinking this naming convention might continue with the other 2 episodes, but you could be wrong. We'll get to that later. This journey began when I spotted a Zuckbook Marketplace advert for an Atari 2600 at what I considered a reasonable price. My buddy Lee Smith, go check his channel, his Atari 800 XL Destroyed by Acid series is epic. I'm in it, so I should know. My buddy Lee goaded me into buying the Atari. I put in an offer of £35 which was accepted. It came with 4 really terrible games and 1 joystick and a pair of paddles. This will be called console number 1 throughout this series. As usual, I shared my impressions and photos on Twitter and struck up a conversation with the truly brilliant Matt, aka @GothMogPlays. Follow him on Twitter, he's a saint. During this conversation I mentioned I was a tiny bit frustrated that the Atari was in such good condition and fully working. Matt offered to send me a broken one that he happened to have, for free. Having already been the recipient of a PS Vita from him, I was reluctant to take something else without being able to recompense him in some way. Matt, the scheming weasel, suggested that in return for sending the Atari I make a video about its repair and restoration, hence why we're here. I was intrigued by this notion and expressed mild interest. I pressed him to at least let me pay something for it. Matt suggested an alternative. I should repair and restore the Atari and then auction it off for charity. And that is exactly what we will do. Once episode 2 has aired, I will auction off the second Atari 2600 and all of the proceeds will go, at Matt's request, to the British Heart Foundation. Console number 1 works fine. In fact, really fine. The picture quality over RF is excellent. But RF is not easily used with today's digital biased flat screens. The Atari 2600 was first produced in 1977. I was 9 years old and first saw one at a friend's house. Endless sessions developing severe hand cramp playing Space Invaders and Combat gave me a taste for something that would become a lifelong obsession. No, not the hand cramp. That was more a side effect of being a teenager. Anyway, an RF connection just won't do. So we need to composite mod all 3 of these machines. First on the bench is number 1. I wanted to practice on what would be my own console before I started poking around with hot tools inside something that would ultimately belong to someone else. As I mentioned earlier, this console works fine, but it does require some attention. The capacitors have previously been changed for radial types. Radial types? I've sourced some replacements, for the most part, of the axial type, so we'll be swapping these ones out. Inside the main unit is another capacitor that some gorilla has swapped for a radial. I will have to replace these with, well, radial. Turns out these are really hard to buy in axial format, but I will make a neater job of it than this. Look at that solder blob. To complete the composite mod, I need to first remove the old modulator. A fairly simple task, removing as much of the solder as I could with suckers and braid before bending the leads away from the edges and wiggling the board free. Next, there are some components to remove from the main board. The first one is a transistor, heating each leg in turn while putting pressure on the other side with a pair of tweezers, and it's free. This red plastic gizmo has something to do with adjusting the sound levels. We won't be needing that. Heating each leg in turn and wiggling is the chosen method here. Fresh solder helps lubricate the process. The next two are resistors, which can simply be chopped out. I prefer to either chop it out and remove the legs, or chop one side and remove the remains that way. A wire for the sound needs to be run out of the metal casing, ready to be attached to the socket. I'm using some old speaker wire as that seemed appropriate. It needs to be attached to a pad where one of the resistors was just removed. This is me trying to impersonate Big Clive and his dexterous soldering skills, and failing miserably. Once I manage to tin the end of this, it allows me to poke the wire through the old resistor hole and solder it in place on the other side of the board. This is a composite mod board which I made from some perf board. It's not the best thing I ever created, but for the purpose of testing it will be fine. The aforementioned Lee Smith of Lee Smith's workshop, wow, kindly CNC milled some really neat circuit boards to replace this thing. We'll see those later on. A handy hint here, a big lump of blue tack is really useful as a third hand, not just for holding in components. And here, in my helping hands, is a 4-pole socket. Almost all of this will be changed by the end of the project. The composite mod boards will be changed, the socket will be wired differently due to the different pinout in the new right angle leads I chose to use. Working on this console I learned quite a lot, and the changes I made ended up in all three consoles. The connections where the RF modulator used to live are where we'll pick up our 5-volt ground and video signal. So with the temporary mod wired in, does it work? Not with that cartridge. Some of these haven't been used in decades and still need cleaning. Warp lock works! It's still terrible. And looks really bad. Those gel bars are some of the worst I've ever seen. I suspect this is a combination of unshielded wires and possibly my composite mod, along with the fact I hadn't installed the metal shielding over the mainboard while testing. Later on, after some changes, this looks a bit better. Before moving on, and in vain hope of improving the picture quality, I decided to carry on with replacing the capacitors. This large one is actually fine, but I wanted to make use of the parts I bought for this project, so it's getting a new cap. Here's a kit from eBay. I only bought the one kit, they're fairly expensive to buy this way. Later on I purchased the parts needed to recap the other console separately. This is meant to be all the parts needed to service a 6-switch Woody. It doesn't, however, include another cap, which is located on the mainboard. The other smaller cap is removed and tested with an ESR of 2.6 ohms. Compared to the new cap with 1.8, I wish I knew if that was important. I show it mainly for the benefit of those who know about these things. Whilst I'm on this side of the board, I remove the chiclet capacitor. The kit contains a like-for-like replacement. Watch out in the other episodes for a different style replacement. There it goes. It's difficult to tell on these pictures, but there was possibly some improvement in the picture quality. It's still terrible. This is a 1977 piece of electronics trying its best to work with something whose remote control probably has more computing power. The last part to replace on the switchboard is the voltage regulator. After doing this, I found it was better to put the thermal paste on the heatsink instead of the voltage regulator. Instead of connecting the composite wires direct to the board, I decided to install a pin header. This will make moving the same composite mod board between the three machines easier for testing purposes. The pads have started to lift on this fragile old board. I carefully solder in the pins, which should provide enough mechanical strength to prevent them pulling away. Being from the UK, it's a given that I'm terrible at joust. I've no idea what to do, but I'm having lots of fun doing it. The last cap is this one on the main board. As I said at the start, its replacement will also have to be a radial cap. So not much change is expected in performance, but the upgrading quality of the soldering and craftsmanship will be a solid mediocre instead of shoddy. Time to do the washing up. While I have the bucket of murky water on the bench, I give all three of the consoles a thorough scrub inside and out, taking care not to get too much water on the delicate paper serial number sticker. A blast with compressed air is a really fast way to expel excess water, one of the handiest and noisiest tools I have. To protect the fresh clean plastic, I give it a quick coat of Renaissance wax. I can't rave about this stuff enough. Get some, you won't regret it. Shame my buffing brush insists on shedding all over the place. Here's the old composite mod board I made, and here is a board made by the lovely Lee Smith. Much nicer, I think you'll agree. A nice easy build with all of the components clearly marked for me. I left out the 75 ohm resistor to test if it helped with the picture quality. I couldn't see much difference. In the end, I didn't use it. I might revisit this at a later date. All three consoles have switches that have badly corroded. This isn't really surprising. The bare metal being handled with sweaty snack food impregnated fingers was always going to suffer and will need some extra attention. I'm using some 000 wire wool with some polishing compound, being careful not to let the metal fibres drop inside the switches or anywhere else on the board. The gentle wire wool works well on these and doesn't remove the textured surface of the metal. As I want to mount the composite socket under the back lip of the console, I needed a cable with a right angle plug. It was at this point that I discovered, I'm sure I'm not the first, that not all of these 3.5mm 4-pole to RCA are wired the same. Some swapping of the wiring was required internally, but in the end it worked. I spent some time researching the best way to go about this. The excellent ctrl-alt-rees, check out his channel, has a particularly good video in which he mods noted gaming celebrity Jason Bradbury's off of the Gadget Show on Channel 4's console. Rees merrily drills holes in the back of the case, at Jason's request, for the RCA sockets, and that's absolutely fine by me. No judgment here, Rees, you Neanderthal. Only kidding. What you do with your own or Jason's console in the privacy of your own cave is entirely up to you, and you won't catch me casting aspersions here. Where were we? Oh yes. I decided to mount the socket in such a way as to not require any criminal drilling of the case. Here you can see for the first time a bracket I designed and printed which allows the panel mount socket to be installed in the existing hole in the back of the Atari. A link to the Thingiverse page will be included in the description. My first attempt was to attach this using these mounting pads. This didn't work out, and in the end I glued the bracket in place. Some scored lines in the plastic will help the glue to key to the shiny surface. The audio coming out of the Atari is mono, so these two terminals are linked here at the socket, so the sound will be sent to both sides. In an effort to improve the picture quality, I decided to use some shielded cable. This is an old USB extension cable. It carries an extra wire which I snip off. Inserting the plug into the socket will help to dissipate the heat while soldering and therefore reduce the risk of melting the inside of the socket. I've chosen yellow for the composite signal, red for the audio and black for ground. The salvaged USB cable is just a little too thick to go into the strain relief channel. It's not important as there's little chance this will be pulled like the old RF cable would have been. At the other end of the cable I attach a ring terminal crimp to the shield ready to screw this down to the case. The bare shield wire is also covered with some heat shrink tubing. On the other cables I'd solder some DuPont sockets to the video and ground and a DuPont plug to the sound wire. I prefer to crimp my own DuPont connectors directly to the ends of the cables in order to keep them as short as possible, but I don't yet own a suitable crimping tool, so this will have to do. Something else our friendly neighbourhood Lee Smith sent me were some O-rings he'd lasered out of some black foam. Enough for all three machines. You legend. And that's that. This was a fairly straightforward refurb with only minor attention required on some of the old solder points. Nothing too drastic. In the next episode I'll be repairing and restoring the Atari 2600 donated by Matt Gothmog Plays. Some broken joystick ports and nasty cracked solder on the switchboard will be the order of the day there. Once that episode goes out I'll be listing the charity console with its extras. Others I've yet to mention have kindly donated to include in the auction, but we can discuss that next time. In the third episode we'll take a look at the console I affectionately named Trash Bag. This one is much more of a challenge with chips installed in sockets the wrong way around and a ribbon connector ripped from the motherboard taking traces and pads with it. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Goodbye!